Yes, but and our family is here, Bruno, at Outwith. This must be our home. Bruno didn't understand what ergo meant, but he didn't need to because he had a clever answer for father. But grandfather and grandmother are in Berlin, he said, and they're our family too, so this can't be our home. Father considered this and nodded his head. He waited a long time before replying. Yes, Bruno, they are. But you and I and Mother and Gretel are the most important people in our family, and this is where we live now, at Outwith. Now don't look so unhappy about it, because Bruno was looking distinctly unhappy about it. You haven't even given it a chance yet. You might like it here. I don't like it here, insisted Bruno. Bruno, said Father in a tired voice, Carl's not here, and Daniel's not here, and Martin's not here, and there are no other houses around us, and no fruit and vegetable stalls, no street and no cafes with tables outside, and no one to push you from pillar to post on a Saturday afternoon. Bruno, sometimes there are things we need to do in life that we don't have a choice in, said Father, and Bruno could tell that he was starting to tire of this conversation, and I'm afraid this is one of them. This is my work, important to our country, important to the Fury. You'll understand that someday. I want to go home, said Bruno. He could feel the tears welling up behind his eyes and wanted nothing more than for Father to realize just how awful a place Outwith really was, and agree that it was time to leave. You need to realize that you are at home, he said instead, disappointing Bruno. This is it for the foreseeable future. Bruno closed his eyes for a moment. There hadn't been so many times in his life where he had been quite so insistent on having his own way, and he had certainly never gone to Father with quite so much desire for him to change his mind about something. But the idea of staying here, the idea of having to live in such a horrible place where there was no one at all to play with, was too much to think about. When he opened his eyes again a moment later, Father stepped round from behind his desk and settled himself in an armchair beside him. Bruno watched as he opened a silver case, took out a cigarette, and tapped it on the desk before lighting it. I remember when I was a child, said Father, there were certain things that I didn't want to do. But when my father said that it would be better for everyone if I did them, I just put my best foot forward and got on with them. What kinds of things? Asked Bruno. Oh, I don't know, said Father, shrugging his shoulders. It's neither here nor there to say anyway. I was just a child and I didn't know what was for the best. Sometimes, for example, I didn't want to stay at home and finish my schoolwork. I wanted to be out on the street with my friends. Just like you do. And I look back now and see how foolish I was. So you know how I feel? Said Bruno hopefully. Yes, but I also know that my father, your grandfather, knew what was best for me, and that I was always happiest when I just accepted that. Do you think that I would have made such a success of my life if I hadn't learned when to argue and when to keep my mouth shut and follow orders? Well, Bruno, do you? Bruno looked around. His gaze landed on the window in the corner of the room, and through it he could see the awful landscape beyond. Did you do something wrong? He asked, after a moment. Something that made the Fury angry? Me? Said Father, looking at him in surprise. What do you mean? Did you do something bad in work? I know that everyone says you're an important man, and that the Fury has big things in mind for you, but he'd hardly send you to a place like this if you hadn't done something that he wanted to punish you for. Father laughed, which upset Bruno even more. There was nothing that made him more angry than when a grown-up laughed at him for not knowing something, especially when he was trying to find out the answer by asking questions. You don't understand the significance of such a position, Father said. Well, I don't think you can have been very good at your job if it means we all have to move away from a very nice home and our friends and come to a horrible place like this. I think you must have done something wrong, and you should go apologize to the Fury, and maybe that will be an end of it. Maybe he'll forgive you if you're very sincere about it. The words were out before he could really think about whether they were sensible or not. Once he heard them floating in the air, they didn't seem like the entirely kind of things he should be saying to Father. But there they were, already said, and not a thing he could do to take them back. Bruno swallowed nervously, and after a few moments' silence, glanced back at Father, who was staring at him stony-faced. Bruno licked his lips and looked away. He felt it would be a bad idea to hold Father's eye. After a few silent and uncomfortable minutes, Father stood up slowly from the seat beside him and walked back behind the desk, laying his cigarette on an ashtray. I wonder if you are being very brave, he said quietly after a moment, as if he was debating the matter in his head. rather than merely disrespectful, perhaps that's not such a bad thing. I didn't mean, but you will be quiet now, said Father, raising his voice and interrupting him because none of the rules of normal family life ever applied to him. I have been very considerate of your feelings here, Bruno, because I know that this move is difficult for you, and I have listened to what you have to say, even though your youth and inexperience force you to phrase things in an insolent manner. And you'll notice that I have not reacted to any of this, but the moment has come when you will simply have to accept that I don't want to accept it, shouted Bruno, blinking in surprise because he hadn't known he was going to shout out loud. In fact, it came as a complete surprise to him. He tensed slightly and got ready to make a run for it if necessary. But nothing seemed to be making Father angry today, and if Bruno was honest with himself, he would have admitted that Father rarely became angry. He became quiet and distant, and always had his way in the end anyway. And rather than shouting at him or chasing him around the house, he simply shook his head and indicated that their debate was at an end. Go to your room, Bruno, he said, in such a quiet voice that Bruno knew what he meant, business now. So he stood up, tears of frustration forming in his eyes. He walked towards the door, but before opening it, he turned round and asked one final question. Father, he began. Bruno, I'm not going to, began Father irritably. It's not about that, said Bruno quickly. I just have one other question. Father sighed, but indicated that he should ask it, and then that would be an end to the matter and no arguments. Bruno thought about his question, wanting to phrase it exactly right this time, just in case it came out as being rude or uncooperative. Who are all those people outside? He said finally. Father tilted his head to the left, looking a little confused by the question. Soldiers, Bruno, he said, and secretaries, staff workers. You've seen them all before, of course. No, not them, said Bruno. The people I see from my window, in the huts, in the distance. They're all dressed the same. Ah, those people, said Father, nodding his head and smiling slightly. Those people? Well, they're not people at all, Bruno. Bruno frowned. They're not? He asked, unsure what Father meant by that. Well, at least not as we understand the term, Father continued. But you shouldn't be worrying about them right now. They're nothing to do with you. You have nothing whatsoever in common with them. Just settle into your new home and be good. That's all I ask. Accept the situation in which you find yourself, and everything will be so much easier. Yes, Father, said Bruno, unsatisfied by the response. He opened the door, and Father called him back for a moment, standing up and raising an eyebrow as if he'd forgotten something. Bruno remembered the moment his father made the signal, and said the phrase and imitated him exactly. He pushed his 2 feet together and shot his right arm into the air before clicking his 2 heels together and saying in as deep and clear a voice as possible, as much like Father as he could manage, the words he said every time he left a soldier's presence. Hail Hitler, he said, which he presumed was another way of saying, well, goodbye for now. Have a pleasant afternoon.